Thank you for being part of our Safer at Home series. Always good to have you here. As you know, as we've been doing this now for a little while, we got a couple of rules. Make sure that you're muted. If you want to turn your video off, that's fine. If you want to keep your video on, that's okay too. These programs are brought to you by Cape Cod 5 through First Citizens Credit Union and from Martha's Vineyard Savings. We want to thank them for their support. We also want to thank Eight Cousins Bookseller because every book that we've got, every speaker that we have, they've got copies of the books, and these are being recorded. So I want to make sure that what you know is being recorded. If you've got a question at the end on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat feature. So if you've got a question for Dr. Joseph, make sure you type it in, and we'll do that at the end. I'm really honored and I'm really pleased to have Dr. Peniel Joseph join us today. He's from the University of Texas. He is in charge of and the founding director of the LBJ School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy down at the University of Texas. He was at Tufts before that, where he founded the School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He has written several books, and his latest on the sword and the shield. Welcome, Dr. Joseph. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hey, Mark. Thank you for having me.
So, as we talked a little bit on before, you've got a subject here, and you've certainly written about people that have been involved in the civil rights movement, but you've got kind of, if you will, kind of the yin and yang of the 1950s, 1960s civil rights movement in Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Talk to us about them and what made you write the book. What did you find out about them? Describe what your research. What did you find out?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mark, for the invitation to speak about this book and my work. You know, you say yin and yang. I really make the argument in The Sword and the Shield that when we think about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., they are more convergent than divergent. They're revolutionary sides of the same coin. So in a way, I wrote this book because the previous books and research on King and Malcolm, I thought, framed them in ways that were not satisfying. And so what I do in The Sword and the Shield, and even the book's title, The Metaphor of the Sword and the Shield, usually we think of Malcolm as the sword, the political sword, and King as the shield. And really, I argue that both of them serve as both political sword and shield over the course of their really about 12 and a half years in public life. For Malcolm X, it's 1952 to 1965. For Dr. King, it's 1955 to 1968. And Dr. King is, to conceptualize what he's advocating, I use the term Black radical citizenship. And by that, I mean King defines citizenship as not just voting rights, but as really human rights for all people. But he talks about citizenship as a guaranteed income. He looks at citizenship as voting rights, but more than that, guaranteed income, healthcare, food justice, decent housing. And we see that culminate in the Poor People's Campaign, where he tries to bring a multiracial coalition army of the poor and occupy Washington, D.C. nonviolently until justice comes through policy. With Malcolm X, Malcolm is arguing for what I call radical Black dignity. And Malcolm's very interesting. He's the boldest critic of white supremacy, structural violence, institutional racism, what we're calling systemic racism right now, of the 20th century. And in a way, what Malcolm does is serve as Black America's prosecuting attorney. He prosecutes white America for a series of crimes dating back to racial slavery against the Black community. And so it's really, really profound. Like, we're in an age where people are talking about white privilege and white fragility. Malcolm's bold activism and his denunciation of white violence, white anti-Black violence, anti-Black racism, really brought out white fragility and white innocence and white privilege in big, big ways. Malcolm X becomes this frightening figure, but he's really a much more complicated and nuanced figure. And this notion of radical Black dignity, he's talking about eradicating white supremacy, but he really doesn't defend Black humanity to white people like Dr. King does. He takes that as a given. And that's why I say he's the prosecuting attorney. King is the defense attorney. He's defending both sides of the color line. He's defending whites to Blacks and Blacks to whites. And what's so extraordinary about Malcolm and King, even as when they first come into the political stage, they are divergent and they are disagreeing with each other. Malcolm thinks of King as some kind of Uncle Tom and nonviolence as something weak. King misinterprets Malcolm's Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism and call for radical political self-determination as Black supremacy. And over time, they're going to converge. Over time, Malcolm is going to say the March on Washington is the farce on Washington, and that King should have shut down. That King should have shut down. I think I keep seeing people. I'm going to have to. Okay, good. Hide the thumbnails. That King should have shut down the city of Washington D.C. And not have some stage managed celebration. King, by 1965, is actually going to agree with that and say, after the Los Angeles rebellions of 1965, say that political nonviolence is going to be used as a sword, a nonviolent political sword, to really paralyze cities in an effort to achieve racial justice. So what we're going to see over time is they both come to see you need radical Black dignity and citizenship in service of this larger human rights movement. And what's really interesting when you see both of them in action, and what I do throughout the book, is when you see them side by side, you really get a better understanding of their political thought, their political activism, their shortcomings, their successes, but the way in which they serve as each other's alter egos over time.
What I found fascinating was that they only met face to face once. Is that true? And there's a famous photo of the two of them, but they really only met one time.
Yeah, so they meet one time, but there's really more to that relationship. So they meet March 26, 1964 at the US Senate while the Senate is filibustering the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And when we think about that meeting, they're both in transition during that meeting. Malcolm has just left the Nation of Islam and is an independent political activist. And he is in the midst of he unleashes the speech, the ballot or the bullet, where he is saying that voting rights matter. He's supportive of voting rights, but he's also saying that what he means by ballot is freedom. And when he says the ballot or the bullet, he's talking about self-defense against racial terror, which is really a big feature of the time, then and now. So I think one of the most interesting parts about when you study the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the 60s, is the amount of state-sanctioned violence that you see from both white law enforcement and white vigilantes in a way that we've scrubbed from history. So Malcolm is very, very well aware of the depth of racial oppression. He's been in New York City. He's opposed and protested against police brutality from New York to Los Angeles. He's met with big city police chiefs trying to get civilian police review and reforms that don't ever get institutionalized. Later, Martin Luther King Jr. by 64 is going to be doing the same thing. So when we think about them in 64, Malcolm is transitioning into a leader who is talking about the civil rights movement should be a human rights movement. And King is on his way to winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But what was really extraordinary is that they both come to the Senate in support of the Civil Rights Act. They're both supporting the Civil Rights Act. And even though that's the only time they meet, that year, right before meeting, Malcolm had been speaking to the journalist Robert Penn Warren for a book, that King was interviewed for separately too, Who Speaks for the Negro, which comes out the next year. And Stokely Carmichael and all these other civil rights luminaries are interviewed. And he says that him and Dr. King have the same goals. And he says that goal is human dignity, but they have different tactics. They both that year are in support of a school boycott against racism in New York City public schools. There's 450,000 students who boycott the schools in the spring of 1964. And really, Malcolm, before one of his trips overseas that year, he spends 25 weeks in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe in 1964. He offers Dr. King help with what Dr. King is organizing in St. Augustine, Florida, the oldest city in the United States, organizing campaigns to desegregate that city. There's going to be a lot of violence. There's going to be night marches. Black protesters are going to be beaten when they try to desegregate beaches in St. Augustine. And then when we think about 64, when Dr. King comes back from winning the Nobel Peace Prize, Malcolm is in the audience when King is delivering a speech. He's sitting right next to Andy Young. Nelson Rockefeller's there, about winning the Nobel Prize, what that means in a global sense. And he speaks about that speech. He praises that speech a few days later in Harlem. And then finally, Malcolm tries to visit King in Selma in February of 1965, February 5th. And Dr. King is in prison. He's in jail for voting rights demonstrations. And Malcolm's able to speak with Coretta Scott King. And he tells Coretta Scott King that he admires her husband, that he's just there to help and to show both racist and the political establishment that there are other alternatives if Dr. King's movement is not allowed to secure voting rights.
Malcolm's death has a big impact on Dr. King, does it not? Because in some, as you point out, Dr. King's methods and MO kind of become essentially mirror Malcolm's towards the end of Dr. King's life. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, everything except for the idea of self-defense of violence. Malcolm, his notion of political self-determination, his bold criticism of white supremacy, his anti-colonialism. Malcolm came out against the Vietnam War before Dr. King, before SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in '64. King comes out against the war April 4th, 1967. King says the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world in April of 1967. He ends his relationship with the Johnson administration. He says the triple threats facing humanity are militarism, racism, and materialism. King is saying that the halls of the United States Congress are running wild with racism. What's so extraordinary about King is in front of the American Psychological Association. He says the biggest threat to American democracy is white supremacy, and that white Americans are producing chaos through anti-Black racism, discrimination, and segregation, and then making the claim that there would be peace in the world but for the chaos that they're producing. It's really extraordinary. And then finally, Malcolm had always said that the United States had committed a series of crimes against Black humanity. By 1968, early '68, King is in Marks, Mississippi, organizing the poorest zip code in the United States. And he's in tears when he hears mothers talking about how they can't afford blankets, they can't afford food for their children. The Great Society has failed this group of people. And he tells them that the way they're living is a crime. And he adds that in the 19th century, the United States gave away millions of acres to European immigrants and settlers, but refused to give 40 acres and a mule to African Americans. And he says that these white racists are hypocrites because these are the same people telling Black people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So King becomes this really revolutionary, prophetic figure who is still interested in the beloved community, but he's interested in a beloved community that requires shared sacrifice. I think one of the lessons of Dr. King that go unnoticed is King was requiring white people to sacrifice, Black people as well, but white people to sacrifice privilege, to sacrifice power, to focus on a redistribution of wealth and justice in the United States, but also to sacrifice the indiscriminate use of violence that continues to plague the United States and the world up until today.
Malcolm was influenced by Marcus Garvey. For those that don't know, would you spend a couple of minutes and explain the influence on Marcus Garvey on the United States and his whole movement?
Yeah, Marcus Garvey is the Jamaican organizer who starts the Universal Negro Improvement Association and comes to the United States in 1916. He helps to build the largest Black mass movement in American history. So there's going to be 3 to 5 million people who are part of the Garvey movement. And the Garvey movement is a movement for radical political self-determination, both in the United States, but Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, Latin America, South America. When we think about Garveyism, the whole notion of sort of Black is beautiful is coming from Garvey. There had been Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists before, but Garvey is able to sort of build a big tent that includes some leading Black women and male organizers, but within the diaspora. So people are both Black American, they're Jamaican, they're from Panama. There's an Afro-Latinx context to Garveyism. And Malcolm's parents are Garveyist activists. And when we think about Garvey, that slogan he has, "Up you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will." Garvey's interested in the cultural politics of race. He's interested in anti-colonialism and the freedom of Africa away from European dominion. He's interested in Black economic power. And there's going to be left and centrist and right wings of the Garvey movement. You know, the more right wing of the Garvey movement is just more interested in a kind of Black capitalism, Black people having economic power that's not necessarily interested in social justice. The center of the Garvey movement is sort of folks who want to create Black businesses, small Black businesses. And Garvey, the movement employs about 1,000 people in terms of different businesses, including a thriving newspaper called Negro World that becomes really the forerunner of the great Black press that we're going to see in the 1940s and 50s, especially with things like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the New York Amsterdam News, the Los Angeles Herald Dispatch, and the California Eagle. And when we think about Garveyism, Garvey, the left wing of Garvey is really folks who are talking about race and class. So there's going to be actually Black socialists who are connected to Garvey. And the reason why they're going to be connected, they want to be part of this mass movement, even if they don't agree with every aspect of Garvey. And when we think about Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam is coming out of the ferment of the Garvey movement. So after Garvey is arrested and deported on really spurious mail charges, Garvey didn't do anything. The government wanted him out. And he's going to be deported and he's going to die in London. And when we think about what he leaves behind, he really leaves behind this idea of organizing around Black nationalism as an anti-racist project, Pan-Africanism as an anti-racist project. So that's the legacy of Garvey and Malcolm.
Obviously, Dr. King was a Christian minister. How does he view Malcolm's relationship with the Nation of Islam? What's his personal and private or public view on the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm's role in that? And if it was public, did Malcolm have any response to that?
Well, I think King is going to be respectful publicly and say he's a man of faith, but certainly King is a Christian. Malcolm is going to say, you know, Christianity is all about a cesspool of Western civilization and Western imperialism and immorality. So the Nation of Islam is going to connect Christianity with slavery, suffering, and death, and the Muslim faith with freedom and citizenship and dignity. So I think that King is going to be respectful publicly, but I'm not sure what King privately thought about the Muslim faith.
The joys of live technology. Since we're in Massachusetts, you're in Texas, but we're in Massachusetts. Both Malcolm and Dr. King had relationships and impact and influences in Boston. Talk a little bit about that. How did Boston impact both of them?
Well, it's interesting. So when King is a sophomore in college, Malcolm is incarcerated in Charlestown, and then Concord, before Concord becomes a max facility, and then Norfolk. He spends the 76 months in prison there. And Malcolm moved to Roxbury when he was 15, 16 years old to be with his older half-sister after his father had been murdered by white supremacists and his mother placed in a psychiatric facility. So Roxbury, the streets of Roxbury, Malcolm is there for several years as a hustler, as a laborer, and eventually he's going to be arrested there and spend his formative years from 20 to 27. He's incarcerated, but that's where he's going to encounter the Nation of Islam, and really Malcolm Little, his birth name. He's going to become Malcolm X, and X is really the Nation of Islam surname for members, because they're making the argument correctly that Black people really didn't know their last names because of racial slavery. Nobody came from Africa with the last name of Washington or Jefferson. So they argue that these are signs of bondage and shame. King is going to go to Boston University from 1951 to 1954, 55, and get his PhD in 1956.
You also wrote a book about Stokely Carmichael, and obviously that's pretty much the definitive biography of a pretty impressive and influential Black figure in the 50s and 60s. This is obviously not the first biography of King or Malcolm X. How would you compare the three, and what did you discover about Malcolm and Dr. King that you didn't know while doing your research?
Well, I'd say Stokely is a bridge figure between King and Malcolm. Stokely knows Malcolm and King. He knows King very well, considers King a friend. But Stokely first met Malcolm X in 1961 when he was 20 years old, and Malcolm debated Bayard Rustin, who's the Black radical social democratic queer organizer of the March on Washington, and an icon in LGBTQIA communities, but social democratic Black freedom struggle communities as well. And so when we think about Stokely becomes somebody who's a bridge figure between Malcolm and Martin in a lot of ways. Unlike Malcolm, he has a close relationship with King, especially from '66, the Meredith March, where he unleashes the term Black Power, all the way to King's assassination. They become very close, but they had met in 1963. And when it comes to like, what didn't I know? I think that part of it is there's certain little nuggets of information, like I didn't know Malcolm listened to King's speech on December 17th, 1964 in New York City in Harlem, when King does the Nobel Prize speech after his return from Oslo. There's aspects of Malcolm X and what Malcolm was doing overseas, and granular information about him being at the Organization of African Unity conferences, and what he was doing with different African and Middle Eastern diplomats. The depth of it becomes surprising in a lot of ways, even as I had read and done a lot of research on him. So I think that you always find nuggets, both in the archives, but just through speeches. The last 7-8 years, I've had a chance to read more of Malcolm and Martin's speeches and listen to the speeches, but also read the speeches than ever before. And so that all of those things are a revelation, including how much they, at certain points in their lives, talked about racial slavery and the connection between racial slavery and Jim Crow segregation and contemporary racial oppression.
Malcolm said that he felt that his work allowed, I'm totally paraphrasing, but basically it allowed white people to accept Dr. King. You know, that Dr. King was the acceptable one. Malcolm was the firebrand. Is that fair to say that both of their work, independently of each other, helped shape the other one's work? I mean, and is Malcolm's assessment a fair one of how white America viewed Dr. King and viewed Malcolm?
Yeah, I think they serve as each other's alter ego, and I think that the presence of Malcolm allows King more room. And as King becomes much more of a global figure, especially starting in '63 with Birmingham, that ferment allows Malcolm to have more popularity and access to, because the movement becomes such a national movement by '63. In a lot of ways, 2020, I know everybody's been comparing this year to 1968, and I understand why. A pandemic, plague pandemic, 20 million people protesting, almost 5,000 separate protests. But truthfully, a lot of this is more similar to 1963, you know? So 63, there's not any legislation that's passed, but there's a 10-week period in the spring of '63 where 15,000 people are arrested, and there's almost 800 separate demonstrations in the United States for civil rights. This year dwarfs that, the largest social movement in history. This Black Lives Matter 2.0 movement. But '63 shows you how there's now room at the national level for both, because even though King is on his way to the March on Washington, Time Magazine Man of the Year, there's still going to be bubbling discord and protest and rage and anger. Medgar Evers is assassinated. Different Black people are unjustly killed throughout '63. Birmingham becomes a real black eye in the nation, because white authorities led by Bull Connor, a vicious racist, white supremacist, anti-communist in Birmingham, Alabama, they unleashed German shepherds on children and peaceful demonstrators. And they also use fire hoses on peaceful demonstrators that are powerful enough to strip the bark off of trees. So what's so interesting when you look at '63, which is such a pivotal year, you've got international newspapers, French newspapers, and the headlines are, they say sauvage, and they're calling white folks in America savages, because they're saying only white savages could do this to Black human beings. So it's really extraordinary. So when Kennedy's saying that, seeing the German shepherds biting on Black kids make him sick, Malcolm X rightfully denounces Kennedy because Kennedy doesn't send any troops in. But once Black people rebel on Mother's Day in Birmingham, Kennedy sends troops in. So the president was being hypocritical. By June 11th, Kennedy's going to make really a fantastic speech saying he's for civil rights, he's for social justice, racial justice. But before that, Kennedy had dropped the ball, and we've set up a mythology about JFK like he was a civil rights president. He wasn't. By June 11th, it's his finest moment. I argue, and I did an op-ed for the New York Times, Kennedy's finest moment is a civil rights speech. It's not the moon, it's not Ich bin ein Berliner. What could be more important than civil rights and Black humanity? A lot of white people don't think so, but I'm certain that I'm right.
As we sit right now here in 2020, there are only 2 holidays on our calendar that are named after people. It would combine a bunch of things. That it is down to Columbus Day, and that we may not be Columbus Day much longer, and Martin Luther King Day. And I think Martin Luther King deserved his own day, and I think most people would agree with that. As we're in 2020, have people start, has there been more of a need, a want, a basic understanding to learn more about Malcolm as well as Dr. King and about the two of them? You know, that I'm not saying there's ever going to be a Malcolm X day, but 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 do people want to learn more about the opposite side of the same coin?
Well, yeah, you know, and I would argue, Mark, that they're not the opposite side. They're more converging, even as they start out in different places. They meet and they converge, which is what my book is about and argues and illustrates. But yeah, Netflix had a 6-part "Who Killed Malcolm X" series that was very, very popular and launched a new investigation into who his actual murderers were by New York State. Um, there was a cable show called Godfather of Harlem on Epix, a streaming service that had Malcolm X as a character during the 10 parts, and it's set in 1963 during all the episodes. Malcolm makes a cameo in Ava DuVernay's 2015 film Selma. So yeah, there's been more, and now that there's Malcolm X papers at the Schomburg, there's a treasure trove for historians and archivists to really dig deep into who Malcolm Little and Malcolm X was. One of his daughters is coming out with a children's book, The Young Malcolm. So there has been more interest, certainly in '92 because of the Spike Lee Malcolm X film, but there's been renewed interest for a whole new generation, because that film in 2 years is going to be 30 years old, which, you know, is extraordinarily, it's extraordinary how time how time flies so fast.
Are are more people understanding that there was a more edgy Dr. King towards the end of his life? You know, you know, we seem to juxtapose that this radical Malcolm X and this more moderate Dr. King, and yet you've argued pretty convincingly that they do converge into pretty close to the same voice. Have more people started to appreciate that end of Dr. King?
Yeah, and it's been a slow going. I think over the last 2 decades, Michael Eric Dyson has a great book, I May Not Get There With You. Cornel West has edited something called The Radical King. Tavis Smiley has a book called The Death of Martin Luther King. There's a great documentary called King in the Wilderness. So we're seeing a lot more focus on, I've written not just this book, but a series of many op-eds on Dr. King and what his legacy and what his life really means, especially for our own, because so much of the challenges that King felt America was on the precipice of in 1968, we've only amplified those challenges and those ills in ways that we can all feel around us, with sort of unprecedented racial division, economic inequity, violence, poverty. So these are all things that King, not only did he stand for eradicating, but he really felt that the United States, America, could be the beacon that eradicated those things. So that's what's so interesting. King has a very specific patriotism that's not the patriotism of people who want to go to war, people who are racist, the people who want to oppress people, but it's a patriotism of saying that the country's founding ideals, if we expand upon them and include all people in there in terms of liberty, justice, freedom for all, the United States could be this global role model and liberty's surest guardian around the world. So it's very interesting. Even in '67, he says at Riverside that it's going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle to achieve the country. So it's really interesting how King has a really deep love of the United States and the potential of the United States in a way that Malcolm always is skeptical of. You know, Malcolm is skeptical, and remember, they had different lives growing up. Malcolm, you know, if your dad was killed at 6 by racial terrorists, that's going to scar you for life. And if your mom is placed in a psychiatric facility for most of your adult life, the way in which you're going to perceive America is going to be much different than if King, his father was the preacher, pastor of one of the best churches in Atlanta, Ebenezer. President Obama just spoke there for John Lewis's funeral. King goes to Morehouse College when he's 15 years old. Morehouse was the best college that a Black young man could go to, all boys school in 1944, when King goes there. And it still is the best college right now today. So King is in what you call high cotton in the African American community, where you're saying, hey, he's living a dream life. He's living a dream life. So he comes to have much more hope in the possibilities of reform than Malcolm. Although by the last 3 years of his life, he comes to really converge with Malcolm in saying that you've got to embrace the depth and the breadth of racism and inequality in the United States. You have to uncover and pick off all the scabs and the wounds, and then we have to begin again. James Baldwin says famously, begin again, and there's a great book by Eddie Glaude on the bestsellers list right now about Baldwin and called Begin Again. So King is saying that too, and it's really remarkable because he's really using the language of Malcolm X. He's jabbing and pointing his finger in the air like Malcolm did about the racist and the racism. And he's doing that because he cares about poor people so much. He cares about the least of these so much, so he becomes this prophetic Old Testament figure with that kind of fire. So he's Jeremiah, he's Job, he's Amos. For those of us who know our Bible, that's who he is, right? And it's really extraordinary to see. The more you do research on King and Malcolm, the more you are fascinated and inspired by them.
One of the benefits of being an historian is we get to look back, sometimes, in this case, 50 years, but look back and really analyze lives and take stock of things that may not have been apparent during the time in which they were alive. 50 years from now, if you're looking into your crystal ball, who's a current leader that you think is going to be well remembered as an heir to these two?
Well, I think there's many. I think that, we have people like Reverend William Barber, who's more of a Generation Xer / young boomer. You've got Tamika Mallory, who's connected to Black Lives Matter, Patrice Colors, Alicia Garza, Brittany Packnett. There are folks coming out of anti-mass incarceration movements, Black Lives Matter, Black feminist. There's going to be, Black queer activists. So I think that it's really spread out and diffuse right now. There's some justice leaders like Brian Stevenson, who runs the Equal Justice Initiative, that I'm sure people will talk about with great reverence, and what he's done in terms of incarceration and anti-death penalty. And then the African American Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, some people call it the lynching memorial. So I'd say that those are just some, but there's really a lot. I think one of the interesting parts about our contemporary landscape, in contrast to the 1960s, is how less male it is in terms of, we think about patriarchy and sexism. There were always Black women who were leaders, but they were not allowed to speak at the March on Washington, just because of sexism. These are things that are crazy that would not have happened today. So you don't get Rosa Parks, you don't get Goya or Richardson. They just are supposed to be mute and stand up and take a bow. Now, we would have had BLM activists snatching the mic from people and saying that we're out here in the streets too. We're in Alabama and the Mississippi Delta, and we're dying and getting shot and getting assaulted too. And so we're going to speak, which makes complete sense. And so I think now we don't have any cult of personalities built around people, And some people have asked me, do I think that this is more effective or the old model was more effective? And I'll have to say this is more effective, because the old model meant that if people died, were assassinated, had any kind of scandals, they really hurt the movement. when the movement is the star of the show, and basically on some levels, yeah, people are important, but these sort of local leaders and these spokespeople are not who we're hanging on to every word. It becomes we're much more interested in policy, right? And so Black Lives Matter, whether it's reimagining public safety, redistribution of wealth, reparations, no cash bail, free education, free healthcare, publicly financed campaign, voting rights for all these different policy agendas that they've come up with in terms of ending prisons as we know it, rethinking parole, probation, getting progressive district attorneys. They've been really on the ball in terms of saying this is really about transforming policies that will transform people's lives than one particularly charismatic figure, whether that's a man or a woman. Man, woman, or non-binary, who whatever. We're just not focused on that person, which again, that's what makes this movement so powerful. I think the last few months, if there had been one person who we all identified with BLM and all these protests, that person would have taken away from this moment, because we would have all been focused on that person or that 2 or 3 or 4 people, when it's really millions of people that were a part of this, right? You know, but of course the public still likes to latch on to people, and we've seen it with the anti-racist books and certain people are focusing on, and that's fine. But in terms of the social movement, it's been good that it's not one person.
Okay. If you got any questions for Dr. Joseph, make sure you use the chat feature. Somebody did ask a question, and I think it's pretty fascinating because it kind of segues into what you just talked about. Which of the two, Malcolm or Dr. King, do you think would be a better guide to lead the country through its current circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually think you need both. I think, and you see it with the BLM movement, Malcolm has a really great structural critique of what's going on. And I think Malcolm is justifiable in showing political outrage. I mean, there's a quote from Malcolm in '64 where he says, Black America is angry and I'm the angriest. That, you know, he has a right to be angry in his own time about incarceration and premature death and Black kids with asthma and lead poisoning and asbestos poisoning and environmental racism, police brutality, people being shot and killed and paralyzed because of racial segregation, economic impoverishment, drug addiction that's criminalized instead of medicalized. All those things he's right to be angry about. And anger has a place in politics and within civil society. People have the right to be angry. They shouldn't be violent. I don't think Malcolm X actually fomented violence. The United States is violent. Racial slavery was violence. And when we think about the Tulsa massacre, when we think about the racial pogroms, the racist pogroms, the anti-Black pogroms that historically have been carried out, violence is as American as apple or cherry pie, like H. Rap Brown said. So once Black people started to say they were going to defend their own lives, which Malcolm advocated, they had the Second Amendment right to do so as well. People said, well, you know, you're preaching violence. So these are all these sort of double standards that always occur. And King, nonviolent civil disobedience was effective. So I think BLM has connected Malcolm X's outrage and his structural criticism of saying, look, there are systems involved here at the global, national, regional, local level that we have to be aware of so we can defeat them has been important. But then also King's notion of saying we're going to have massive civil disobedience to transform this country and to build this beloved community. So I think you really need both. And in a lot of ways, through the BLM movement, and now so much white allyship and solidarity with the BLM movement, you've seen both.
Never thought of the word pogrom when thinking of it. You're absolutely correct. I'd never associated the two. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I think that this is obviously amazingly topical, amazingly insightful, and I think you do a very good job of coalescing two seemingly divergent personalities and how much they impacted each other for two people who only met one time in person.
Yes.
So I thank you very much for the work you have done and continue to do. Great continued success with this book. And with what's your next project? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm working on a book on 1963. And 63, I think, is a really just underrated year. It's an unbelievably important year. A lot of times we just think of it as sort of JFK assassination or March on Washington. JFK is not assassinated until November 22nd, 1963. So he's president almost for a full 11 months, which is extraordinarily important. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a shock. But there's so many different things that are going on. Gloria Richardson in Cambridge, Maryland. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time comes out in January of that year. It's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a really, really extraordinary year. Bobby Kennedy meets up with James Baldwin and Harry Belafonte and all of them on May 24th at his father's apartment. It's just an extraordinary year, and I want to delve deep into it.
Good luck with that. Congratulations on this book. Thank you very much for joining us. To continue to stay healthy, safe, and hopefully sane. Is University of Texas going back to live classes, or
they're doing hybrid? I'm teaching virtually.
Okay.
I've got little ones, so I have to teach virtually.
There you go. We're all becoming a little too proficient at the Zoom stuff. So I think. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Dr. Joseph, thank you very much. Good night. Good luck with this book.
Thank you.
Thank you.